All right. Series it's selling is Outcast has a really, really interesting and special guest today. I have Dr. Ryan Pettengill, who is an expert in late 19th century, early 20th century, Gilded Age, gangsters, and history. So, Doctor, why don't you just, before we start, I'm going to call you Ryan because we're going to keep it formal. Um, Before we start, why don't you give like your credentials and why you decided to, why you found a passion for this part of history? So go right
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me first and foremost.
Of
I
course.
enjoy
Are you
your
kidding?
work, so there's that. We can start with my credentials. My PhD comes from Michigan State. I got a PhD in American history in 2009. And like any doctoral student, I had to produce a dissertation. And what I like to tell my classes is if you don't know what a dissertation is, it's a long, boring book that virtually nobody reads. But in any case, like anything else, it needs a topic, and my topic was labor and working class history. Now, specifically, it's grounded in Detroit, and when it comes to the history of organized crime, that's not necessarily your first stop, but it's certainly on the rounds, if you understand what I'm saying. So
Mm-hmm.
this underworld that exists between organized labor and organized crime, it was something that was on my radar. But to be completely honest, I had always had this fascination with organized crime, the mob. I saw every movie that I'm sure your audience is familiar with. So there was always that, but quite honestly, and embarrassingly as it might be, I put together the podcast, which is the history of organized crime in the United States.
That's right. Great podcast, by
Basically,
the way.
yeah, thank you. Basically, it's a pitch, or at least it started out that way. It's a pitch to my boss so that he would allow me one day to teach that as an actual academic class. It just kind of, the great thing about a podcast is I don't have, a week by week semester. There's no dean that I have to report to. There's nobody that's ultimately going to tell me what direction or not that this needs to go. So I do have a lot of freedom. So that's basically my credentials and how I got into this world. I can talk a little bit more about, my specific area of my knowledge basis when it comes to this particular topic. But I'm going to go ahead and start out by saying, although you see, like AMC a few years ago had a good series involving, what was it called? The Making of the Mob.
I believe so.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. I think it's
so
on
one is
Netflix
in
now.
one's in New York, the other is in Chicago. But in any case, they say you can't really understand the world that produces the mob if you don't understand poverty,
That's
inequality in
right.
the late 19th century.
That's right.
And while that's true, it doesn't do a very good job of exploring that world. So
Mhm.
the world of John Morrissey, who I and many others that have written extensively about this consider to be the first mob boss in American history. That world really does do an effective job of telling that story. So
Okay. Yeah. Well, we're gonna get to that. But where do you teach now? Do you teach in college or high school? Or?
I teach at community colleges throughout North Texas.
Okay.
The place that I was telling you about is the University of Texas at Dallas. So I'm in the northern part of Texas. So
Okay.
which
Um.
actually
I,
has plenty of connections to organized crime, even though again you don't necessarily think of Dallas as your first stop in
yeah.
time.
Well, we'll get into it, but we might not get into it today. But later on in future podcasts, we'll get into it. I mean, the Italians really had an outpost in every major city in the country at one point.
Sure.
Um. What is the name of your podcast again?
It is entitled "An Offer You Can't Refuse: The
That's
History
right.
of Organized Crime in the United States."
Yeah, and I listened to one of the one that you actually sent me, and
Mhm.
what's great about first of all, you have a great speaking voice. Secondly, it takes a totally different approach to organized crime. It kind of leaves out a little bit of the grit and the down and dirty stuff, and it's more of an intellectual, sociological point of view about organized crime, why, how, so on and so forth, and it kind of breaks down like everybody loves the grit and the blood and the murder and that kind of thing, but this breaks down as to the deep rooted reasons as to why organized crime is rooted in politics and corruption, and how these guys stayed on top, which is something that a lot of people don't get into. It's just it is a tremendous podcast because it's still mob related, gangster related, but it takes a very scholastic approach to that world. So the first question I want to ask you is, yeah, if you haven't, I say this all the time, you haven't noticed all the mafia documentaries, the outlaw biker documentaries, they're always on Sundays on like the History Channel. And that's because they know that mostly guys are home on Sundays from work. Men love underworld, organized crime, mafia stuff. It almost doesn't matter whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's Italian, whether it's bikers, drug dealers from the 70s, like Frank Lucas. Men love that. Why do you think men love that kind of crime the most? Because it's by far, and this is why I have to try and take a different approach on my podcast, because there are so many podcasts that revolve around this. Why do you think that men love this kind of taken on this history kind of thing?
I mean, I don't know. On the most basic of levels, it's portrayed as very glamorous.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that grit. You don't see the shall we say, the people that don't necessarily make it to the top. All you see is the Tony Soprano's living in his $3 million house. You see the cars, you see things like that. The other thing that I would say is it kind of presents this fantasy world that I'm not a psychologist, but it allows us to kind of exist in this world where we might want to exist, this world with no repercussions. The guy tries to pull one over on you, tries to give you a raw deal, and you send some people to go give him a beating. And it's one of those things that, I mean, that's one of the things that I find fascinating about this world is that you can kind of act out those sorts of things. So.
Yeah, lucky for you, Ryan. You're not the only intellectual in the Zoom meeting right now. If you look right behind me, I have 2 degrees. I have a bachelor's and I have a master's degree, one of which is in psychology.
Oh, nice.
So thank you. So for me, I think why men love the power and the corruption. I think it's instinctual. So if you take it from an evolutionary point of view, the people that were on top throughout history were always the most ruthless. Whether you look at the Vikings or you look at the Mongols in China or you look at the samurais in Japan, the most ruthless always reigned supreme. They always got the most women, had the most, they were the most feared. They got the most land, they had the most riches. And if you didn't have that kind of backbone, if you will, for lack of a better term, you just weren't there. And there's something very admirable about somebody that would put his life up for a cause outside of rules and regulations in normal society. And I think it's still instill us till this day. I mean, listen, you watch the movie Goodfellas and you're rooting for Joe Pesci. You're rooting for the bad guys. You're not rooting for, you watch the one with Al Pacino, Donnie Brasco. You're not rooting for the FBI. You're rooting for the gangsters, even though they're going to wind up dead or in jail, because they all do. There is something internal in men that love and admire the men that don't care about the rules and regulations and go out and do whatever they have to do to better themselves. But most of us can't. Right. So I think there is something internal. I mean, listen, somebody cuts you off in traffic, right? And you're angry, and all you're thinking of is pulling that guy over and beating the hell out of him, right? But you shouldn't. And most of us don't. But we wish we could. And you have that element of people that would. right? And then it brings to the point where you don't want to mess with that kind of guy. And there is always that instinct where two men face each other and they go, where is the line before I get physical? Right? It kind of keeps men in perspective, right? Like two men look at each other and there is a problem. There's friction. And they know if there's a line that they have to cross, there's a line that they cross, it's going to get physical. And this is instinctual in men. I mean, no matter how big, how small. And then there are people that you walk up to and either their energy or their aura or their history or whatever about them, you know, the line, it ain't too far. And I think we all fantasize about being that guy, right? Because when you watch a movie, you never, or read a book or whatnot, you never think about the guy. You never put yourself in the position of the guy getting beat up or the guy getting killed. You always put yourself in the position of the guy giving the beating, right? Like the scene from Goodfellas where Ray Liotta, the guy's messing with his girlfriend, and Ray Liotta gives him a beating with the gun. You're not putting yourself in the position of the guy getting his ass handed to him with the gun. You put yourself in the Ray Liotta position because, oh man, it feels so good. You just wish you could do that, but you know there are circumstances and consequences, and a reasonable person would not. But there is some animalistic instinct to us that admires the person that can do it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, so we'll get on from that. Okay, and I had another question. I forgot. Okay. Anyway, so you basically are an expert in what's referred to as the Gilded Age. Why don't you explain what the Gilded Age is?
That's a great question. Let me start out with where it gets its name. You're familiar with the author Mark Twain?
Sure.
So he's a comedian. At the end of the day, he's a comedian. And it's actually Mark Twain that gave the late 19th century its name, and he was being ironic. He called it as such because these people that are coming over, they're coming from places like Ireland, later on Italy and Russia, and they're being told by these American corporate labor recruiters that the streets of Chicago, the streets of New York, they're paved with gold. And these people show up and they find out, in fact, the streets are not paved with gold. If you've ever read that book by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, they're plastered with other things. But anyway, it's Mark Twain that gives it its name for its very shallow values. It's all about profit. It's all about how much productivity can you squeeze out of that worker. It's a time period where virtually, for good, better, or worse, you don't see government in any element of the American economy. And, I certainly could live with less government, but I also like knowing that when I take a drink of whatever it is I happen to be drinking, that there's an actual medical doctor or a scientist that has cleared this for human consumption. That doesn't exist in the late 19th century. And that was really what Mark Twain was driving at when it comes to the Gilded Age. The other thing that I might add, it's got this very Poole-metric sort of feel to it, in the sense that you have a guy by the name of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon, literally creates this not only a university, but an elite university, one of the most elite universities in the world. And at one point, he had more money in his bank account than they did in the U.S. Treasury. There's that level of unimaginable riches. And in a lot of cases, it's sitting side by side with bone grinding, poverty, poverty that I'm not really sure that you and I, as 21st century Americans, could really truly appreciate, given the world that we grew up in. So that's the late 19th century. It's a very, very dangerous time. It's a very interesting time period, but it's also one of the most important time periods in American history. And if you if you listen to that podcast that you were referring to, that episode, toward the end of that, I point out why it's such an important time period, because it sheds light on these problems in American life. whether this be, living hazards. We're talking about a time period where you're from New York, so you'll get this. The dumbbell tenements in New York, you'd have tuberculosis come in one end of it, and because there's no requirement saying that these landlords have to have a ventilation system or even a window for that matter, it spreads like wildfire and people die. They drop like flies. There's nothing to say that you can work your workers 16 hours. And if you don't like it, right there's the door. So it's a time period where, there's these really big glaring problems. And if you don't do something about them, then someone else is going to. And the academic types generally go to, the Socialist Party, the anarchists, later on the communists. They'll do something about this if you don't. But I would argue that we should take a closer look at what people like John Morrissey and individuals that, while they certainly do some good, maybe we can talk about that, the benevolence that we think of as the American gangster. But in any case, while they are able to do some good, they're also really exploiting the institution that is poverty, human suffering. So this is the Gilded Age, and it's a very critical time period, not only for the history of organized crime, but also American history broadly defined.
Yeah. I agree 100%. Being poor in the United States today is completely different as being poor in the 19th century. You'd have to go to a third world country today to actually compare it. Because if you're poor today, you can have housing with Section 8 and the projects. You can get food stamps. You can get aid. There's so many ways that the government steps in to help, and it's good, and it has its good reasons and its bad reasons at the same time. But that's a whole other discussion. But yes, it was. You think of immigrants coming over to the United States now, maybe like from Mexico, when there were 10, 12 in an apartment building. It was like that in the 19th century, only more dangerous because, like you said, there was no ventilation. There was no really code for the buildings. The landlords could pretty much just put up a brick building, and that's it. And it was very dangerous. I mean, there was that famous fire, and there were underage girls working as seamstresses. I think they were 14, 15, 16 years old, and there was a famous fire during I think it was the early 20th century, if I'm right, in New York. Oh, okay. And it killed, I don't know how many people. And, there was no fire escape. There was nothing. And unfortunately, it takes something treacherous to happen like that, or something terrible to happen like that, in order for, okay, well, now we need a code, right? We can't let this happen again. Now we need fire escapes. Now we need ventilation. It happens all the time. And that's why I was an electrician for 10 years. The book changes. The code book changes all the time because things happen that you don't realize, oh, that actually could happen. So we have to adapt. And so we don't want that to happen again. So we have to change. And at the same time, that's why things take so much longer now, where back then, I think how long did it take to put up the George Washington Bridge? Like 2 weeks.
Amazing what we get done when,
but today it would take, 3 years and $1 billion. And okay. So the time period that you are an expert in, which is absolutely fascinating to me, there was obviously a famous movie that Martin Scorsese directed. It was a book. It was called, what was it called? Oh, Jesus. I can't even.
Gangs of New York.
Gangs of New York with DiCaprio, Liam Neeson, Daniel Day-Lewis, who is by far probably I am going to say probably the greatest actor ever, but he's definitely up there with Brando and Meryl Streep. I mean, the guy is just, there's nothing. It's almost like he comes out of hiding, wins an Oscar, and then goes back.
That's a pretty good analogy. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I think he has 3 or 4 best actor Oscars. I believe so. Right, My Left Foot.
Yeah.
The one where he was Native American. I forgot the name of it.
Last of the Mohicans.
Last of the Mohicans, right? And then he had he didn't get it for Gangs of New York, but he got it for, which is a fascinating movie, of course, There Will Be Blood, exactly. Which again is in the time period that you're an expert in.
Yeah.
So what basically we're going to do is, we're going to talk about the actual characters in the movie, and because the movie's 3 hours long, but you're still stuffing 3 pounds of shit in a 2-pound bag. I mean, this is a period of time that's 100 years or 80 years or whatnot. And so we kind of want to, organized crime was different back then as we think about it today. So obviously the main character was Bill the Butcher, and John Morrissey. Was he a character in the movie or no?
Yes and no. I see elements of him in Daniel Day-Lewis's character, Bill the Butcher.
Okay. Okay.
I also see elements of him in Leonardo DiCaprio's character. There are, if you know what you're looking for, you can see the influence that is Morrissey all throughout that movie. And it's not just in character. I would say New York City being a character in the film as well.
Okay.
That comes through pretty clearly as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what we're gonna do is John Morrissey is a distinct character during that time period, but not really in the movie. It's kind of here hit and miss, but he is looked at as the first mob leader, organized crime leader in modern American times, if you will. So what I wanted to do was talk about Bill the Butcher, and there was several gangs running rampant in the Lower East. It was the Lower East Side, the Five Points.
Yes.
And then segue into John Morrissey and how he kind of changed that, if you will, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So
Sure.
in the movie Bill the Butcher, why don't you explain the significance of that character, the gangs of that time, and the corruption and whatnot?
Okay, so let's start out with Bill the Butcher. Bill the Butcher is American born, and I think if you've seen that movie, that goes without saying. He is this individual that I don't know. It's been a while since I've actually sat down and taken some time with that movie, but it seems like he's got this love-hate thing going on with immigrants, and many of them are Irish. One of the things that I want to make sure we're clear on during this period is that the Irish weren't necessarily greeted with open arms. I'll say it wouldn't have been anything out of the ordinary whatsoever to see a sign in a shopkeeper's window that said something to the effect of "Now hiring Irish need not apply." So the anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant sentiment during the 1830s, 40s, and especially in the 1850s is really, really running high. And Bill the Butcher's character manifests that. Now, the character himself is an actual human being. His last name is different. His last name in reality is his full name is William A. Poole. He took his level of anti-immigrant, anti-Irish hate all to a next level. He was, I think today, what we would call a political terrorist in the sense that he belongs to this overarching political organization referring to itself as the Native American Party. Now, this is a political organization, but it's a very confusing title because when we think Native American, we think people that were here before people of European ancestry started showing up. It's got nothing to do with indigenous people. These are individuals that generally do not like people of the Irish variety, the German variety, of the immigrant variety coming over, and they're willing to carry out acts of violence, especially to keep them from voting. They were a very tight-knit group implementing their political violence. And when the authorities were to question them, because they had vowed this code of silence, their common refrain was, "I know nothing. I don't, what do you want from me? I don't know anything. I can't tell you who, can't tell you what, can't tell you where." And so nobody, if you ask the common history buff on the street, nobody would be able to tell you about the Native American Party, but they would be able to tell you about the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party is really going to hit its stride in the mid-1850s when you see immigration, especially Irish immigration, running at a high tide. Bill the Butcher is a manifestation of that sentiment in American life. And what they were really, him in particular, what they were really, really angry at, it wasn't just that these people were coming over. They're beginning to erode native-born, English-speaking, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant political position in American life at a very critical juncture in American history. These people are coming over and they're falling into organizations known as political machines. We can talk about that in a second if you'd like to, but these political machines exist in all of your urban centers. St. Louis had one, Philadelphia had one, and naturally, New York had one. The one in New York was known as Tammany Hall. It traces its roots all the way back to the 18th century. Frankly, it runs well into the 20th century, really well through the 1960s. And basically, you couldn't get elected dog catcher in New York or even the surrounding areas unless you had direct connections to Tammany Hall. Bill the Butcher just came at that with everything that he had. And by consequence, because so many of the voters that are voting for these candidates that Tammany's putting up, a lot of them happen to be Irish. So, yeah.
Okay, so explain, because in the movie and even in the book, Bill the Butcher has a ragtag bunch that basically carries out whatever he says. Explain how he, if you can, his background, how he grew up, how he became this leader of sorts, and what was the purpose of having these men around him constantly doing what he needed to do.
So the gang that you're referring to is the Bowery Boys, and they're like-minded individuals. They're people that want to really, what we're talking about here is preventing these newcomers from casting ballots. They're really trying to, in their minds, reform American politics, but generally speaking, they're trying to keep these newcomers from voting. I don't know if you want to get into this or not, but there's an element of race that is deeply embedded into this, even though we don't think of the Irish as a race. But going all the way back to Henry VIII, we see the English referring to people in Ireland as an inferior race. And people like Bill the Butcher felt like these individuals had absolutely no business in the sophisticated system that was American democracy. So many of you that have seen the movie might know the character known as Boss Tweed. Now, Boss Tweed is what we call a political boss. If you want to go more down the road of political science, it's a political ward boss, an alderman. Now, these guys are not politicians. They're not political candidates themselves, but they are the individual that chooses who gets put up in whatever election that you're talking about. And if it sounds like there's an enormous amount of power that's behind these ward bosses, there's an enormous amount of power. And so throughout the movie, you see this very, at times, strained relationship between Bill the Butcher and Boss Tweed. And what Bill the Butcher is bringing to that equation are votes over the course of, and this is where the historical inaccuracies kind of, Scorsese takes a little bit of liberties with the actual historical narrative there. But over the course of the film, you see him deploy his guys, as you put them, to kind of move the electorate in the direction that they want them to go. There actually is a historical political term for these individuals. They were known as knockers, and specifically shoulder knockers. And there's a good part in the film where DiCaprio's character, he grabs this guy, and the guy says, well, I've already done my civic duty twice already. He's voted twice already. And DiCaprio kind of laughs that off and he shoves them back into the polling places. That's the value that people like Bill the Butcher are bringing to New York politics at that particular time. And as I said before, you see direct inferences from John Morrissey that are kind of manifest in people like Daniel Day-Lewis's character, which is Bill the Butcher. And the value that they bring to Tammany Hall, to these political machines, is they can pretty much ensure electability. And that's worth its weight in gold during this period, because with an assured election victory comes an awful lot of money, and with a lot of money comes a lot of power. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, well, it leads me to another question. Nobody's going to do something for nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So when Bill the Butcher and the Bowery Boys basically bring votes and force people to vote over and over again and so on and so forth, I'm sure that there is something in return that he receives. What is it from Tammany Hall that he gets?
Excellent question. Excellent question. And it really is the essence of, at the very least, the 20th century mob, broadly defined. It's a foundation of organized crime, generally speaking. What he has I would argue, is really two things. Number one, the ability to function out there in the open. Case in point is gambling. I mean, there's a lot of money makers that are making people like Bill the Butcher, John Morrissey, in reality, an awful lot of money, and they also happen to be illegal. Can I take us into a slightly different direction when it comes to Hollywood for a second?
Sure.
Really good example of this would be Boardwalk Empire. Nucky Johnson is the Atlantic City version of Boss Tweed. He's the guy behind the guy. He's not the guy running, but he's the guy that decides who gets put up to run for whatever position that you're talking about. And these political connections, what they're going to do is they're going to ensure that you can run your gambling den pretty much out in the open. So you can continue to make money off of something that was technically illegal, but if the people that are in charge of enforcing the law, if they just happen to be looking in the other direction, then who is this really hurting? It's that level of complicity. And you see this, it's not just with Morrissey, you see this with numerous different actors. I would argue that Charlie Lucky Luciano figured it out pretty early in his sort of rise to the top. That what you need is the coordination and the complicity of those that are in charge of enforcing the law, right? Don't want to stand out too much, because if you're making all this money and it's very clearly illegal, then you're going to attract the attention of law enforcement to the point where they're going to have to do something about it. However, if you're better at blending in, and those individuals that are in charge of enforcing the law, they're never around, they're conspicuously absent whenever it is that an illegal activity is going down, then there's some real power in that. But there's something that I would argue is even more powerful than that. Obviously, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of gambling dens. There are brothels all up and down the 5 Points. There are illegal alcohol, serving institutions. I mean, organizations that are operating without a license. What John Morrissey, the first mob boss in American history, what he's able to offer these people that are breaking the law is he's able to offer them protection. Right? I mean, this is really the essence of organized crime, the ability. I'm kind of thinking of that scene in Goodfellas where Henry Hill is explaining to the audience, how this whole world works. It's no different than what was going on in Italy. It's just that they're doing here. And Paulie's character, he gets a piece of all of these people that can't go to the real police. They can't go to the FBI. What Bill the Butcher in the movie, anyway, I think the reality is quite a bit different. But in the movie, and certainly John Morrissey, what they're able to do is they're able to offer gamblers, saloon keepers, pimps and madams. They're able to offer this protection. I can protect you not only from the law, but also from your competition, right? If there's a guy that's cutting in on your territory, maybe his saloon just so happens to get raided, because if you're paying this tribute to somebody like Boss Tweed, right, those levels of governmental power are very, very powerful during this period in American life.
Okay, so in the movie, Bill the Butcher, you're saying is basically a combination of two people, right?
Yeah, I see him as such. Yeah.
Okay, and which is very possible. I'm sure if you spoke to Scorsese, he probably would agree, because he's not a guy who doesn't do his due diligence when he makes a movie. Everything is very detailed. So, getting off Bill the Butcher, because it seems like John Morrissey is now I understand why you're saying he is the first real organized crime leader. Explain his background and how he comes to this power.
Sure.
Go ahead.
John Morrissey is an immigrant who's actually going to land in California. He's going to be from Ireland. He lands in California. He's in California in the late 1840s. That's the height of the gold rush. At some point, he decides California is not for me. Maybe he struck out, mining for gold. He ends up in New York. It depends, exactly how much you want to buy into the legend that is John Morrissey. But Legend has it that he walks into this saloon that's owned by a guy named Isaiah Reidner, and I'll talk about him in a second.
Hmm.
And so, according to legend, what happens is he challenges anybody to a fight. He says, I can beat anybody in this bar. And one of the guys that really kind of took exception to that was this. He was a prize fighter in his own right, guy by the name of Tom McCann. And so McCann kind of grabs him. There's some shoulder shoving going on, and he pins John Morrissey down against this stove. It's lit with coals, hot coals on the inside. And again, this is urban legend, but there are witnesses that say Morrissey's flesh began to smoke. On the one hand, that's super, super painful. I think that goes without saying. On the other hand, it gives him this really, really cool nickname. Morrissey's nickname is Old Smoke. And according to legend, that's where the nickname came from. Yeah. It's also really important that you understand that not just McCann, but Morrissey himself is a prize fighter. Now, I'm not saying the word boxer primarily because, for all intents and purposes, there was no such thing as boxing, not anything that you and I would recognize during this time period. Prize fighting, bare fist knuckle boxing, basically, it's a really, really passionately followed sport, but for all intents and purposes, it's illegal. It is also very, very much sort of a incredibly, again, you're the psychologist here, a very masculine institution that appeals to people like John Morrissey. And so anyway, over the course of time, he develops this reputation as a tough guy, a reputation of a guy that can get the job done. And it's not any coincidence that it was the bar owned by Reinders, who is more or less the political boss that has figured out the art of shoulder knocking. What Reiner had done by the time that Morrissey shows up in New York is he had created what he calls his Empire Club. Really, it's just a chain of bars and saloons. And he's using those saloons as more or less a recruiting ground to go out there and get these guys like Morrissey that can move those votes in the direction that he needs them to move. So that's the world that Morrissey starts out. But if we can, let's get back and talk a bit about Gangs of New York, because there is this sort of relationship with the real Bill the Butcher and John Morrissey.
Okay.
Morrissey challenged Bill the Butcher to this fight, and he lost. We can get into it or not, but what happened was the Butcher kind of jumped in, had them in this really compromising position. He was biting the back of his neck, and Morrissey's got a decision to make. You either tap out and you live to tell the tale, or you kind of submit. Or you die. And so he chose to kind of tap out. And if you've seen the movie, you can tell that that's a running theme. The idea that Bill the Butcher in the movie carved his eye out, gave it to the priest because he didn't have the will to look the guy in the eye. And so that actually did happen. He actually did submit, and it's not great for his reputation for the next 2-3 weeks. But you have to understand that the Irish community in New York, they knew who William Poole, who Bill the Butcher was. And they knew that he carried out acts of violence, political violence against their kind. And so when Morrissey vows revenge, again, this is very endearing to the Irish community. By the time that this is all going down, the mid-1850s, the Irish community is huge in New York City. And so there's a scene in the movie where Bill the Butcher, he survives this assassination attempt. He gets hit in the stomach, but he actually wears the vest, and he's pointing to the hole that it made, the attempt on his life. In reality, in Stanwyck Hall, he wasn't so fortunate. He's assassinated, and actually Morrissey's brought up on local murder charges for it. Once again, I cannot overstate this. He is a folk hero as far as New York's Irish community is concerned. This is a guy, it kind of leads us back to what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation. He's a guy that did something that hundreds and hundreds of people wish that they could do, but for whatever reason, they didn't have the nerve, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the resources, whatever, they were never able to get that job done. And so this really enshrines him, in the heart and the soul of the Irish community. There's one other thing, if you really want to understand Morrissey's rise to the pinnacle of New York's underworld in this time period, understand that Isaiah Reidner, the owner of the Empire Club, the guy that's one of the most powerful, you'd never know it by just walking the streets, but he's one of the most politically powerful, politically connected people anywhere in the city. At the end of the day, he's just not one of them. And when I say them, he's not Irish and he's not Catholic. There was a gang war, turf war, that broke out 1853. And at this point in time, Reidner has ambitions, political ambitions that are bigger than New York City. He kind of took this show on the road, Philadelphia, took it as far as New Orleans. He's an aspiring politician. And as an aspiring politician, he took the high road and he condemned the violence. That was not well received by his underworld constituency. It makes him look weak. It makes him look like he's, not the guy that we thought that he was. And so what you're going to see is Reidner rapidly fading from the scene. And I would argue it's almost a foregone conclusion that Morrissey is going to replace him. Morrissey is going to become sort of the replacement for Isaiah Reidner, and he's going to command the Irish votes, and he's going to deploy it to Tammany Hall, cultivating all of these important relationships, getting very, very wealthy and powerful at the same time. And it's going to largely be at the time where Reidner's star is on the sun, is setting. So this is really where he's becoming his most powerful. Yeah.
Okay. So just to make it clear, it was Morrissey's gang, if you will. And what was the gentleman's name that was running for politics?
Are you talking about William Boss Tweed?
No. The gentleman you just
Isaiah Reidner.
Okay, sorry, I'm never going to remember that. But so did the actual turf fight actually happen, or Reidner actually just condemned it and it never happened? So then Morrissey was able to step in.
No, there's a gang war that's happening, and he's condemning the violence. Now, I'm assuming that you are referring to a collection. There were several Irish gangs. The one that's featured probably most prominently in the film is the Dead Rabbits. That's an actual gang, but it was one of numerous. Yeah. There were turf wars all the time. I don't mean to move this in the direction of Chicago, but Johnny Torrio and later on Al Capone, what they were good at was conquering their enemies, but what they were really not great at was having, this enforcement wing that could keep outsiders from coming in and kind of poaching on territory. So there would be gang wars all the time. And a lot of times these gang wars would become very violent, gives Chicago an incredibly bad name. And so this is happening really throughout the course of the late 19th, early 20th century. And you see it on display in 1853 as well. Okay. Reidner condemns this, and this is the beginning of the end for him, and he's going to fade at the same time that Morrissey is on the rise. So
okay. The legend that you speak of, where Morrissey walks into the bar and says he could beat any man here in a fight, basically to establish himself as a formidable underground tough guy, right? Like a legitimate tough guy. I'm going to believe that is true, because that actually happened. Things like that still have happened in reality. One story that comes to mind, that I lived in Bensonhurst, but my parents grew up in Red Hook, and there was this really famous Italian gangster in Red Hook, and how he actually established himself was kind of similar, a little bit different. But he started working for himself. He started loan sharking for himself. The guy's name was Frank Barranca. Everybody called him Frankie Martin. And he didn't like dealing with he didn't hang out in clubs. He didn't, he wasn't the kind of guy that wanted to like shoot the shit, play cards all night. He was all business, constantly. And he was young, and he was loaning money in the street, and he would collect himself. And then, of course, the local, gangsters, the wise guys, whatever you want to call them, were like, who's this kid? You better get the word out before we hurt him. And the legend is that he walked into the social club with 2 guns and said, who doesn't want me pushing money in the street here? And then they had 2 choices. You either kill him or utilize him. So, so I do believe something like that is very possible. Like, and prize fighting, like you said before, yeah, it is not boxing. Back then it was basically bare knuckle, but anything goes. Eye gouging, fish hooking, biting. It was not, and there were no rounds. It wasn't like, oh, take a break. No, there was no round. You went till you either gave up or you died. And that still goes on today. I actually interviewed an underground fighter who fights. He's American, but he actually fights in Eastern Europe. He lives in the UK, and he fights in Eastern Europe, and he does underground fighting. And he won his last fight when I had interviewed him about a year ago by eye gouging. But the guy was not able to tap out. His crew that was with him wasn't really a corner. Again, there was no time limit, no rounds. You go till you can't tap out, you can't give up. You either get knocked out cold where you can't continue, you die, or somebody stops it before you die. So the guy was gouging his eyes out, and it was like the 3rd time, and his eyes were full of blood, and his crew was like, okay, that's it. Anyway, just wanted to say that all those things that seem like legend, they're probably true because it still goes on till this day, right? I was going to actually bring up something else, but all right. So John Morrissey establishes himself as a legitimate tough guy. He has to fight with Bill the Butcher, which kills his reputation a little bit. But then this beef he has with, I can never remember his name. I forget. I apologize.
Isaiah Reidner.
Reidner.
I wouldn't call it a beef. He's basically an employee, if you will. He's one of those tough guys.
Okay.
He's one of those tough guys that Reidner is deploying to kind of control the vote.
I got you.
This is a faux pas. I don't have an equivalent for it, but it's like somebody. It's like signing your own vote of no confidence. When he came out to condemn the violence, and people just more or less lost faith in him.
Right.
And it's not necessarily a feud so much or a power struggle as it is. He was the natural.
I see. Okay.
To fill Reidner's place.
I see. So he was the next in line, and
basically, yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I apologize for the confusion.
Oh no, not at all.
So I'm assuming, and you can go into this. He establishes himself. I'm assuming he takes over the bars, and the muscle, and then he creates his own empire, if you will. So
yeah, no, I mean, basically, what he's in. It's almost like franchising something, right? So if you've got a permission slip from someone like Morrissey to do business broadly defined within the city within this time period, then basically it's a license. And so it's not necessarily him that owns the bar, although he does own bars and saloons, although he is involved in various other forms of vice, gambling and such. It's that he's loaning his political connections and his power, his leverage to whoever it is that's wanting to do these illicit activities and make money from it. So
okay, so he offers protection. One of the things, again, what's funny is that people think that these things are relatively new, the 20th century and whatnot. This has been going on forever, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the, again, just growing up and around that time and doing the podcast at the same time, one of the tactics that they used, if somebody said, no, we don't want your protection, because obviously with protection, that means you have to shell out some money, right? And they squeeze you for as much as possible, as much as you can. One of the tactics is, if somebody says no, then, and correct me if I'm wrong, but only because I've seen this myself, is they actually, that person that approaches them, like a Morrissey, and somebody says no, he'll actually send some thugs in there, destroy the place, give the owner a beating, so on and so forth, and says, now you owe me protection, kind of like putting that person up as a person that I should have been there to protect you from, right? And then he comes around and goes, well, if you had me, that wouldn't have happened.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
go ahead, take it from there.
No, I mean, you can obviously you present a very good example. Yes. When you started saying that, I thought you were going to go in a different direction, but law enforcement, I mean, when I say there's no regulation, there really isn't any NYPD or frankly any other professional police force that you and I or anybody else would recognize to this day. And understand that law enforcement had almost an expected propriety sort of element to it. New York is bad. I would argue that New Orleans is actually worse. There's a guy, he's also Irish in New Orleans by the name of David Hennessy, and he's the chief of police in this emerging professional police force in New Orleans, who actually gets in the middle of this gang war. He's killed primarily for the reasons that you're talking about, the protection in the case involving New Orleans. What they wanted was the ability to appoint, in this case, Italian workers to unload these ships that were coming into the port at New Orleans. One side got it because they basically had law enforcement in their corner. The other side took exception to that and basically took out the chief of police. There's a lot more inferences when it comes to American history that you can make when it comes to the assassination of David Hennessy. But do you remember, and you're gonna, John C. Reilly, you remember his character? He was the cop.
Yes.
And so DiCaprio and his buddy go into this building that's on flame, or excuse me, it's on fire, and they're pulling out everything that they possibly can. And later on, they kind of sit down and they look at what they've got. They're kind of divvying up their loot, and in walks this Irish policeman, played by John C. Reilly. And so, very good example of, if you don't play ball with somebody like John Morrissey, you get a visit from somebody like this. So a lot of times, the line between law enforcement and these wise guys, thugs, soldiers, whatever you want to call them, it's incredibly blurry.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the big distinction between then and now.
Yeah.
But continue with Morrissey. So he establishes himself as a protector. He has brothels. He has politicians in his pocket. He has gambling. What makes of him? What continues? What happens to him?
Well, like all good things, it comes to an end. Boss Tweed is, it goes without saying, one of the most corrupt New York political figures of all time. I mean, that really says something.
Yeah.
But anyway, it gets to a point where it's almost public knowledge how crooked this guy is. There's a very famous cartoonist, wrote for not only all kinds of newspapers, but really well-respected newspapers as well. Guy's name is Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T. And of all the people that might be considered to be public officials, it's Nast, a cartoonist, that really comes after Boss Tweed and puts it out there in cartoons that virtually anybody can dissect. Everybody is able to get the takeaway from what he's trying to articulate, which is corruption. It was estimated that at his height, he had basically swindled the city of New York out of today what would be $50 million. And we're not talking over the course of a lifetime. We're talking about like a 5-year window.
Wow.
And so it's incredibly, incredibly corrupt. And over the course of time, especially after Nast came after him, it was one of those things where the powers that be in New York had to do something. Even if they came from Albany, that somebody had to do something. And so, long story short, Boss Tweed basically flees, right? He tries to go to Spain. Eventually, he's arrested by the Spanish authorities. He's extradited back to New York, and he flips. He flips on Morrissey. At that point in time, at that point in time, before he had fled the country, Boss Tweed had this really inner tight-knit organization that was referred to as the Ring. And everybody that you could imagine, the chief of police, the fire marshal, and of course John Morrissey, all the movers and players within New York that basically are providing this social infrastructure, this safety net that didn't exist before they came along. They're in this ring, and of course, part of the point of the ring is to provide those services that the city municipal government is just not providing. Certainly it's not coming from the federal level either. Part of it is, how can we make money from this? And God bless them, they find all kinds of different ways to make money, and in a lot of cases that's corrupt and it's swindling the city of New York. And so when Tweed comes back, he rats on everybody, including Morrissey. And the authorities come down pretty hard on him. Tweed got arrested in 1871 over the course of numerous different indictments. There's a ton of pressure, psychological, and let's be honest, prize fighting, staying up all night, and drinking massive amounts of alcohol didn't do his body too many favors. And in 1877, he kind of slips away in his sleep. He dies in his sleep. Really? Yeah, the good times were over. But I would argue that he lays it's not just a foundation, because you got to understand, Vice is going to continue with or without John Morrissey. There's money to be made, right? And it's not even, we're not even halfway through what historians refer to as the Gilded Age by that point. There's still lots and lots of money to be made. So that infrastructure's there, but just like Morrissey replaced the guy before him, he's going to be replaced by a guy by the name of Tim Sullivan. Tim Sullivan is going to be one of those tough guys, up and coming tough guys that's able to kind of control that Irish vote and deliver those political connections all at the same time. Have you heard of Tim Sullivan? Does that name mean anything to you?
No, I've heard of John Sullivan, obviously, but not Tim Sullivan.
Yeah, right. Tim Sullivan is one of those names that nobody has ever, people have heard of, but he's not nearly as well known as Arnold Rothstein. You have heard of Arnold Rothstein,
sure, absolutely.
The big brain, right?
Yeah.
And so in any case, it's really Sullivan that's going to mentor this next generation of criminals, which is really going to take the process of organizing crime to a whole new level, and they're going to reach into different elements of American life, and it's certainly not going to stop in New York City. It's really going to transcend the rest of the country all at the same time. But Lindy's, which was, I think probably the best way we would describe it today, be a speakeasy. It was an illegal bar. It was an illegal saloon. And that's really where Arnold Rothstein gets his start. Not only are they serving adult beverages there, but you also have illicit gambling that's taking place. None of this is possible without Tim Sullivan. And so when I say that John Morrissey is the first mob boss, and part of the reason for that is that he lays this foundation that future generations of organized crime is going to build upon, that's really what I'm talking about. I mean, you're talking about 3 generations of organized crime right there, all of which had direct and important connections to Tammany Hall. So,
before I let you go, when a guy like Morrissey establishes himself, I have to believe that, like you said, the next level of organized crime is the Rothsteins, and then you have the Jews and the Italians and so on and so forth. I don't think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, during Morrissey's time, it's probably not as well established, right? There's probably a lot of loose ends. Does he go through a normal gangster's life of constantly looking over his shoulder? Who's going to kill him? Who's going to try to take over his power? Does he go through that?
I mean, I would say so. Yeah, I would say that was one of those reflections that you see, whether it was intentional or not, in Gangs of New York. There's this really, you know the scene where they kill that friend of Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't know who that actor's name is, but they kind of hang him on that fence. You know the scene I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
And so, you know, that guy tells Bill the Butcher right before they kill him, you know, he's only good to you because he's trying to kill you, he's trying to cozy up to you so that he can get you soft. And yeah, of course, that kind of thing, you know, it was pretty much a daily occurrence.
Mm.
There's also, if you're so inclined, there's some really great political cartoons that involve John Morrissey. I'll put it this way: if you're going to come after him, you better not miss, because you know he was a force to be reckoned with as far as a prize fighter. So yeah.
Yeah. Now, was death, or is it just beating, stabbings, or hey, look, we have to, like we think of it today, take the guy out, kill him, so on and so forth.
I
Was
mean,
that
all of the above. Yeah.
all of the above? Okay,
Yeah.
okay, okay. I'm gonna stop you right here, because if I don't, we're gonna be talking all night, because this is so interesting to me that it just leads to the next conversation that I would like to have, which is the
Mhm.
Arnold Rothsteins, the Italians, the Lucianos, and so on and
Yeah.
so forth, and how that's established. Because you are a tremendous mind when it comes to this. It's absolutely astonishing, because I've never heard somebody take such an intellectual approach to organized crime, gangsters, so on and so forth. But you break it down to the point where people could understand why, how, so on and so forth, instead of just the basics of, this is what we do, and this is the blood and guts of it, and so on and so forth. It is a tremendous conversation having with you. It's unreal. It really is. Just, respect all the way through. But before I let you go, plug your podcast again and tell people where you could hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, you can find it wherever you get your podcast. The podcast is called An Offer You Can't Refuse: The History of Organized Crime in the United States. Spotify, Apple, Google. It's
Right.
on all the usual platforms, so that's where you can get it. Um, I Let's see. I'm trying to remember where I am in terms of the narrative. I believe we're in the 50s.
Oh,
Fascinating time period
it
for a
really
lot of
is.
reasons. And, you know, it's really what I'm finding to be so enjoyable is how much different a place like LA is, even from a place like Las Vegas, right?
Mm-hmm.
How much different Las Vegas is as far as the way it was run, even though it was run from, you know, by guys from Chicago and New York. How much different it is than the outfit in Chicago or the syndicate in New York. It's really an enjoyable time period to dissect. I'm having fun with it as a historian because there's a lot of different directions that you can take it. Culturally, you can take it in one direction. Politically, you can take it in another direction. Obviously, it's got economic connections to it as well. So a lot of fun there. Hey, can I give your people some homework before you let me go?
Go right ahead. Absolutely.
If you really want to understand the making of what is now referred to as the Mafia, there's a book I'd like to push. It's not mine. So, book by a guy named Thomas Repetto, and it's succinctly entitled American Mafia. His argument's relatively simple. His argument is what we think of as the Italian Mafia is actually a blended version of Camorra as well as Sicilian. If anything, he says it's less Sicilian than not by the time that it makes it over here to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But he also argues there's a reason why it's called the American Mafia. The the laws, the structure of American laws, which is very, very suited for this particular brand of organized crime. So the way that this was being practiced in southern Italy, in Sicily, when it gets brought over, it's almost tailor-made for the legal system in the United States. And it allows, I mean, something like this had never really been seen before, even by the standards of what we're talking about today. It had never been seen before. It took organization to entirely new levels. And it allowed for the criminal career. Lansky, not Italian, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
So that's and it's not a long, boring book. It's got a lot of different diversity when it comes to its geography, as well as the rackets broadly defined. So I think that if you really want to understand the making of the mob, so to speak, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's where I would start.
Well, I'm going to definitely look that up. And the author is Thomas Repetto, you said?
Repetto, yeah.
Repetto, American Mafia. Is he still alive, or is that book relatively
Believe
recent?
he is. I believe
Okay.
I don't know him personally.
Okay.
I plug his book all the time on my podcast, but I believe he is still around.
Okay. Ryan, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming on. And I would
Yeah.
definitely be in touch because, the content that I could pull from you was fantastic. So I truly appreciate you coming on, man. Really, really interesting stuff. And good luck. And the podcast is an offer that you can't refuse. What is it? A history? You can't
The
just say
history of organized crime in the United
it.
States.
A history of organized crime in the United States. Again, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And like, subscribe, follow Ryan on. He's also on Instagram, which is where I got in touch with him. And like, subscribe to my channel too, Serious and Silliness Outcasts. And Ryan, we'll be in touch. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.